I'm Rick Rosengarten, and I teach religion, literature, and visual culture in the Divinity School. And I'm here to talk to you about the stories of Flannery O'Connor. I'm going to begin by reading from Flannery O'Connor because I don't know of a better way to suggest why she's interesting than to give you some of her own words. Now, this is the end of her story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, probably the most famous story she ever wrote, certainly the most anthologized one. Very brief plot summary: a grandmother and her family are supposed to go on a vacation. The grandmother is a hectoring person who guides the trip and winds up leading them to an escaped convict on an empty road. And the convict confronts them and takes away the members of the family one by one into the forest with his gang. And they wind up alone when we pick up where I'm reading here. There were 2 more pistol reports, and the grandmother raised her head like a parched old turkey, crying for water, and called, Bailey boy," as if her heart would break. Jesus was the only one that ever raised the dead, the misfit continued, and he shouldn't have done it. He's thrown everything off balance. If he did what he said, then it's nothing for you to do but throw everything away and follow him. And if he didn't, then it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you got left the best way you can. By killing somebody or burning down his house or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness, he said, and his voice had become almost a snarl. Maybe he didn't raise the dead, the old lady mumbled, not knowing what she was saying, and feeling so dizzy that she sank down in the ditch until her legs twisted under her. I wasn't there, so I can't say he didn't, the misfit said. I wished I had have been there, he said, hitting the ground with his fist. It ain't right I wasn't there, because if I had have been there, I would have known. Listen, lady, he said in a high voice. If I had have been there, I would have known, and I wouldn't be like I am now. His voice seemed about to crack, and the grandmother's head cleared for an instant. She saw the man's face twisted close to her own as if he were going to cry, and she murmured, Why, you're one of my babies. You're one of my own children. She reached out and touched him on the shoulder. The misfit sprang back as if a snake had bitten him and shot her 3 times through the chest. Then he put his gun down on the ground and took off his glasses and began to clean them. Hiram and Bobby Lee returned from the woods and stood over the ditch, looking down at the grandmother who'd sat and half lay in a puddle of blood with her legs crossed under her like a child's and her face smiling up at the cloudless sky. Without his glasses, the misfit's eyes were red-rimmed and pale and defenseless looking. Take her off and throw her where you've thrown the others, he said, picking up the cat that was rubbing itself against his leg. She was a talker, wasn't she? Bobby Lee said, sliding down the ditch with a yodel. She would have been a good woman, the misfit said, if it had been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. Some fun, Bobby Lee said. Shut up, Bobby Lee, the misfit said. It's no real pleasure in life. Now, Flannery O'Connor's stories are at one and the same time violent and sacred. They are stories that elicit from their readers horror and revulsion, and at the same time a kind of compelling engagement that doesn't quit. It's very striking when you teach O'Connor or you write about her or you present about her in public that the audience is deeply divided. And I want to suggest to you today that that division has something to do with the very human interactions people have with the sacred. Rudolf Otto's idea that the sacred is a mysterium tremendum et fascinans, something that at one and the same time overwhelms and terrifies us and yet compels us, is an idea that's very close to Flannery O'Connor. Another way to put it, which was specific to her, is to remind ourselves of an idea that was expressed in one of her favorite books, the Baltimore Catechism of the Catholic Church, which says that the Eucharist is the sacrament that is the very sacrifice of the body and blood of the Lord Jesus, which he instituted to perpetuate the sacrifice of the cross until his return in glory. O'Connor's story, all her writing life, is about the perpetuation of the sacrifice of the cross in all its horror and all its glory. And it's that idea that is in the stories, and it's that idea that I want to present to you for your consideration today. So let's step back for a minute and talk about Flannery O'Connor's context. Her dates are 1925 to 1964. She was born in rural Georgia. She was born into a Catholic family, an Irish Catholic family, as you can guess from her surname. Her father died when she was a teenager of lupus erythematosus, which we'll hear about again momentarily. And so she was basically connected with her mother, Regina. She was an only child. We know that she was a precocious child. She drew and read from a young age. If you ever get the chance to look at some of her cartoons and drawings, she had a satirical bent from a very young age. And she had talent, no question about that. And she was an odd person. From a very young age, she loved peafowl. There's a wonderful film of her at the age of 5 showing off for a camera a peacock of hers who could walk backwards. And she maintained that interest in birds throughout her life, really. So she was an unusual and precocious child and someone who didn't really fit in anywhere. She certainly didn't fit into her mother's hopes for her. Her mother wanted a genteel young Southern lady who would grow up and marry and fit into society, and that was not Mary Flannery's way in the world, to say the least. She went to the Georgia State College for Women, and while she was there, she decided that she'd be a journalist. And she graduated from college, and for the first time in her life, left home for an extensive period of time and moved to Iowa, to the writing program at the University of Iowa. She came there to study journalism, but she had been there about 2 weeks, and she went to Paul Engel, who is the famous leader of the creative writing program, and handed him a manuscript of a story with a letter. And the letter said what he would not have understood had she spoken it to him because her accent was so thick. The letter said, "I would like to be in your program. This is some of my work." He read the story, which we're pretty sure was an early version of the story from which I just read to you, and immediately admitted her to the writer's workshop at the University of Iowa. The next 2 years in which she did the MFA degree there were years in which she was writing constantly and reading a lot of things she'd never read before. Engel and others there led her to read a lot of the modern writers. Dostoevsky was important to her, Bernanos, et cetera, a long list of people. And so a world opened up to her, a world that she really had never experienced in Georgia. And the possibility, really, of being a creative artist formed for her at that time. She graduated from Iowa and she moved to the writers' colony at Yaddo in New York, where she met, among others, Robert and Sally Fitzgerald, and Elizabeth Hardwick and people like that. And she was going about her career when she went home at Christmas at the age of 25 and felt sick on the way home. And eventually she was diagnosed herself with lupus erythematosus, and she had to radically revise her plans. At first she tried to live away from home, but it became clear that that was going to be impossible. And so at a relatively young age of 25 in 1950, she moved permanently to Milledgeville to live with her mother, and she lived the rest of her life there. She came to talk about that as if it was the thing that allowed her to practice her art. She understood the limitations that had been imposed on her life, physical and geographical, to enable her to write about what she knew. And if you know anything about lupus, you know that it's a particularly cruel degenerative disease. In O'Connor's day, the only treatments for it were blood transfusions and cortisone shots. So she was in and out of hospitals having her blood changed, and she lived with puffy faces and achy joints throughout her life, and deep, deep, deep fatigue. Sufficiently deep that she would get up in the morning, she would go to Mass with her mother, she would come home, and she would sit down, and she had enough energy to write for about 2 hours, and then she had to rest. And the rest of the day she would read, she would correspond with people, but she didn't have the energy to do her artistic work. That was the way she lived the last 14 years of her life. She died at the age of 39 in 1964. The key themes in Flannery O'Connor, in my view, really are two. One is that her art is deeply influenced by the notion of Greek tragedy, interestingly enough. And what I want to suggest to you is that the structure of her narratives is one in which Greek tragedy drives the plot, and the ending is a kind of Catholic notion of the apocalypse and the end time. And so the stories are really driven by the notion usually of a heroine, a woman, usually a single woman or a widow who's trying to run a farm and who has some kind of nemesis. In this story, it's the grandmother and the misfit. In a story like Greenleaf, it's Mrs. May and the bull who cultivates her outside of her bedroom window. In a story like Revelation, it's Ruby Turpin and Mary Grace, the uppity daughter who goes to Wellesley and throws a book called Human Behavior at her head and calls her an old warthog from hell. In every one of these cases, what we see is exactly what we see in Greek tragedy. A hero who has a certain degree of arrogance that they know best about the world, who then confronts someone who turns their world upside down, and they have a moment of reversal and recognition, a time when they see themselves for who they really are, not who they thought they were, and where they see the world for what it really is, not what they thought it was. And that is all driven by O'Connor meticulously and exactly and precisely, so that we as readers can't really deny the reality of what's happening. Just like in a Greek tragedy, it could not have happened otherwise. But having taken us down this path where we're really led to acquiesce in a series of distressing and horrific occasions, the endings are always violent. They rupture this process. And what happens then is that the character has some kind of revelatory moment. Now, the interesting thing about O'Connor's stories is that it was only as she grew as an author that she was willing to disclose more of what they saw at the end. As we could see from the story, A Good Man is Hard to Find, we don't know what the grandmother sees. We know she's attracted to the light, and we know she's pleased by what she's seen, but that's all we know. But by the time we get to Revelation, a story which she finished on her deathbed in a hospital in 1964, the heroine, Ruby Turpin, does not die, but she lives, and in staring at a pig parlor at the end of the story, she sees a procession into heaven of the kingdom, of the realized kingdom of God on earth, of the beloved kingdom, in which the social order of the world that mattered so much to her is completely reversed. And while she and her husband are the only ones who are singing in tune with the Hallelujah chorus, they're at the back end of the crowd that's marching in. So that's the way O'Connor's stories work. The texts as a whole are really arguing for two things, I think. One of these is the notion that the Eucharist is in everything, that the world that we live in is constantly infused with the grace and glory of God. And our chief fault as human beings, in O'Connor's view, is our refusal to recognize that for what it is. We allow social conventions, we allow personal prejudices and egoism to inhibit our capacity to see the goodness in the universe and to act accordingly. So as a consequence of that, the stories are really about the stripping away of our illusions and the insistence that there's something much more real than anything we pretend that's real that goes on there. So that's the pure Catholic story of Flannery O'Connor. How does this text inform present-day thinking or living? Why might someone turn to this text now? I've talked about her Catholicism. What I haven't talked as much about is her attention to the South. O'Connor knew the southern world of Georgia very well, and her stories are chock full of the South. She was fond of saying, there's a great quote from her that says, if you're a northern reader of my stories and you read them, you think they're grotesque. If you're a southern reader, you think they're realistic. And something like that is at play in these stories. This uneasy connection between things that seem on the one hand distressing and on the other hand have great, what we would call verisimilitude. They are real for us. That extended to the uses of language that O'Connor employed. She was free with her terms in the language, and that's caused problems for some of her readers, especially recently. So words that we find inappropriate are in her stories and even in the title of one of them. And she's been a part of the cancel culture of recent years as well at Loyola Marymount University, where a dormitory was renamed because of distress about the language in her stories. I would say it's not predominant, but it's there. and it would be useless to pretend otherwise. If you read deeply into O'Connor's letters, and I would almost urge you to read the letters as much as the stories, you can find a more nuanced view. For example, O'Connor had deep respect for Martin Luther King. She loved Cassius Clay. She was wary of James Baldwin. So she had complicated and nuanced interactions with the public world of black people in her time. She probably was someone who believed in the Supreme Court ruling in Plessy v. Ferguson that separate but equal was fine. And she was probably suspicious of integration. She had a lot of company in the 50s and 60s, including people like Zora Neale Hurston and Ralph Ellison, but that was as it was, and race is a factor in her stories. So is class. O'Connor was very aware of the caste system in the South. She didn't hesitate to talk about white trash. She didn't hesitate to talk about, the elite people, people who had the trappings of wealth versus the poor. She found the poor more interesting than the rich by far. There's very little in her stories about rich people, a lot about poor people. But that whole Southern culture, in all its detail and in all its complication, was really her context and her interest and the inspiration, I think, for, among other things, this Eucharistic vision. That vision for her was available to everyone, irrespective of caste or race, even as she depicted those conventions as deeply as she did. So, the other reason O'Connor is interesting is that writing in the 50s and 60s, O'Connor was writing right before the Second Vatican Council occurred in the Roman Catholic Church. And if we step back from O'Connor to Catholicism, and this is one of the reasons I think she's interesting, we look at an author who on the one hand is very devoted to her church, and on the other hand is very rebellious in relation to it. O'Connor consistently, for example, requested permission from her local bishop to read books that had been indexed by the Catholic Church as forbidden. So she followed the protocols of the Catholic Church vis-a-vis what she could and couldn't read. But she read a lot of books that were on the forbidden index, and she liked them, and she learned from them. Gede's The Immoralist was a favorite, to give you an idea of it, among others. So she was widely read in the literature of her time, and not just what was accepted. She also was someone who really did care about devotion. She was a daily communicant at Mass. She loved the Latin Mass. She wrote one time in one of her letters, "The thing I love about Catholicism is that you can walk into a church anywhere and you feel right at home." And so there's a way in which O'Connor was someone who really loved what she regarded as the universality of Catholicism in her day. And there's a lot of speculation now about what she would have thought about the Second Vatican Council and its changes. But what's interesting to me about O'Connor is that she was changing vis-a-vis the Church of Vatican I and modernizing herself in her writing even as she did it. One of the most interesting things in her stories are her implicit critiques of the church. There's a character in her story, the displaced person, Father Flynn, who is eerily like the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find. He drives all the action. And when we get to the end of the story, he's literally destroyed the farm and left this poor woman to die on her own there. And every day he comes to see her. And in a wonderful irony, he shows up and he gives bread to the peacocks and then goes in and reads from the Catechism to her. And it seems to me that what O'Connor is saying is the priest gets it exactly wrong. It's the woman who needs the Eucharist, and he might as well read the Catechism to the birds. So O'Connor is, for me at least, a very compelling figure because she is so viscerally engaged by her religion and so difficult to characterize. If you look at Catholicism today, there's a proclivity among a lot of people to sort Catholics into the traditionalists and the radicals. There are those two groups, and you're either one or the other. O'Connor defies that kind of characterization. In some ways she was traditional, and in some ways she was radical. And that's 50 years, 55, 60 years ago now. The problem that I experience is that people want her as an advocate for whatever position they have about Catholicism. And therefore she's either a Vatican I Catholic or a Vatican II Catholic. She's either a traditionalist or a radical. And I found myself arguing that she was neither and or both, and decided at the end of the day that O'Connor would work best if O'Connor was brought into colloquy with others. She captures the peculiarly complicated position of a modern writer who's thinking about religion. You have to remember that in the 20th century especially, fiction becomes one of the most important places where people work out various ideas about religion. Not just Christianity, but Judaism certainly, and to some degree Islam. Those are really the laboratories where issues about modernity and religion and secularization and religious authority are worked out. It's especially true in Catholicism. Marty said one time that the best American theologians are its novelists and writers. And I think O'Connor belongs in that crowd as much as anyone does. So I think that's really important. The other thing that I would say is that O'Connor's writing is wonderfully open to interpretation and discussion. If you're going to take a text like Maimonides' Guide to the Perplexed, I mean, you can't just read that text and say, oh, this is what it means. You really have to discuss it and debate it. I think the same thing is true with O'Connor. I also think viscerally O'Connor jars us. You can't look at the stories and not be compelled by them and disturbed by them and feel the need to make some sense of them. If you want to read more Flannery O'Connor, you can't do better than to read her stories. This is a controversial opinion, but in my view, she was a failed novelist. Her novelists are really compilations and stitching together of her stories, and I don't think they work nearly as well. People will disagree with me about that, but I would say go read her stories. The best place to go by far is the collected stories, which bring together her two collections that appeared in her lifetime and some others. It's beautifully put together, it's easily read. The other thing I would do before I read any criticism, including my own on Flannery O'Connor, is I would read her letters, Collected in the Habit of Being, edited by Sally Fitzgerald. This is a wonderful collection of correspondence. It begins when she was young, a young writer. One of the first letters describes her first encounter with an editor who told her that he thought her stories were presumptuous, and she said that she thought he just didn't understand them. And she went looking for help elsewhere. And it goes through her whole writing life and includes some amazing letters. At times hilarious, at times very serious. There's deep theology in the letters, but there's also a lot of acute social observation in them. She had many friends and many correspondents, some famous, not so much, some not so much, but all people who got the full, lavish attention of this really brilliant, really thoughtful, I think largely underestimated woman. There's also a handy collection of her stuff in the Library of America, to which she certainly belongs, which includes many of the stories, both of the existing novels and a lot of the letters. You won't get everything you'll get in the other two books, but you'll get a nice selection from those. So I would say if you want to go to the scholarship, probably the best, there's plenty of books on O'Connor, but the best general book is Paul Ehrlich's book, The Life You Saved May Be Your Own, which locates O'Connor along with Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and Walker Percy as four of the most interesting Catholics in mid-century America. It's not just about O'Connor, but it's reliable on O'Connor, and it's a good book. And it does give some sense of the context in which she worked. So those are the things that I would recommend to your attention, and I just want to leave you at the end with a wonderful quote from O'Connor, and you'll forgive me if I read it from the page. When she died, Thomas Merton, the Trappist monk, was told about it by Robert Giroux, who was O'Connor's and Merton's publisher. And Merton was distraught. And he wrote to Giroux and he said, I don't think of Hemingway or Catherine Ann Porter or Sartre, but rather of someone like Sophocles. I write her name with honor for all the truth and all the craft with which she shows man's fall and dishonor. And on those words, I think we've said enough.